Hi, my name's Will Smith, and today I'm going to talk about projection mapping in Notch. I'm also joined by Harrison Mead, who's another product specialist and has a lot of experience in projection mapping, and will be taking the lead on some of the topics we're going to talk about today. Has anyone been to any of my previous talks before? A few of you? Yep, okay. I'll skip the about me then. Notch for projection mapping, the full 9 yards. So we're going to talk about Notch and how it's used for projection mapping. And I will skip that slide. And Harrison is now going to talk about himself and where he came from. So over to Harrison.
Thank you. Hi. Like Will said, my name is Harrison. I'm a product specialist at Notch as well. But I'm also a Backstage Academy student in my last year, so which means that this is the first presentation I've done without a hangover. So these are just a few examples of what work I've done. I did Glastonbury in 2017. I did a VJ job on that. I've also helped on the workflow with video on the Astana Kazakhstan Expo of 2017. Which was quite complicated with the UVs because there was 125,000 LED lights, which basically translated into pixels. I also work a lot with Production Park up in Yorkshire. I do a lot of the pre-visualizations from CAD drawings when they build the stages. And I was also involved in the first ever immersive classroom, I'd like to say, in the world, which was quite interactive as well. So yeah, back to you, Will.
Okay, so back to projection mapping. So projection mapping is creating a visual spectacle from a static object, such as a flat surface or a building. Projection mapping, also known as video mapping, is a technology of projecting light onto a surface. This technique is used by artists and advertisers who can add extra dimensions and optical illusions and movement into previously static objects. Using specialized software, a 2 or 3D object can be mapped onto the real object in real time. So what is projection mapping? Here are a few examples, some images of other people's work. So we have the London Pace Gallery exhibition, we have the Sydney Opera House, and we have the Disneyland's Magic Kingdom. These scenes all show buildings with various projection mapping displays on them in different forms, and they're awesome. So what is it used for? Projection mapping is used for things like advertising, live concerts, theatres, theme parks, used for decorations and celebrations. It's even been used, I was speaking to some guys, they even do projection mappings on, I don't know whether anyone's heard of the Miniature Wonderland. It's a miniature railway, and they've actually got all the buildings. They build huge cities in miniature, and they actually do projection mapping on those buildings, which is quite cool. So we're now going to show you an example of a very old building with a projection map on. So we're going to play this video. If you can swap it over. So here we have some examples of what people do with projection mapping. And we've sped the video up just so we can go through the whole scene, show you a few different things they've been doing for it. We're going to be doing something like this later, but through Notch and some other software. They're showing the meshes on it. There's some really nice effects on it.
And a lot of this projection is from a UV base of perspective, which I assume if some of you have done a lot of projection mapping, this is the type of workflow that you would do. But we'll go more into detail about UVs later.
Okay, cool. The video's finished.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. So one thing to note, that the last video we just watched, the projection mapping was projection mapped onto a very old building. When you projection map, you need to have a 3D mesh that represents that building. And for something as old as this, you're probably not going to get a CAD file or anything like that for it because it was built hundreds of years ago. So where do you get the information from to produce something like this, and how do you build the 3D model? And we're going to look at how to do this mapping workflow next. So myself and Harrison are going to run you through these different things. We're going to look at how to create your 3D model. We're going to look at the final results in a media server, and we're going to look at UVs again. Has anyone looked at or been to my talks with the UVs? We're going to go into that a little bit more depth again. There's always more with UVs. It's a great topic, but it's something, if you're going to do projection mapping, you need to understand UVs. And then we're going to look into the integration of Notch. So to talk about creating your 3D model, I'm going to hand you back over to Harrison.
Thank you. Great. Awesome. Okay, cool. Okay, so as you saw from our example, that building was quite an old building. Obviously, from when you projection map a building, you need the measurements from when you create your 3D model. Now, with a lot of old buildings, they don't come with CAD drawings, so it's very difficult to find out how you're going to build that 3D model. So what do you do, right? So what's first? So we're going to talk about and discuss 3D scanning. Now, to get the measurements from that building, there's multiple ways of doing that. So first of all, we're going to talk about laser scanning. Now, laser scanning is done by a large scale and can be done from different perspectives, from all-round angles of the building. This has been done quite a lot, but it's quite expensive to rent out, that I'm aware of. And it is very detailed, but it's a very hard workflow to go through. Depth cameras, now this would be from such a small scale, so if we move aside from projection mapping a building, and you want to projection map something a bit smaller, such as shoes or a figurine or anything like that, you'd use something like a depth camera, like an Xbox One camera or an Intel RealSense camera. What I've used from previous projects is a workflow called photogrammetry. Now, photogrammetry is used by a drone or a helicopter or a plane, anything from above, really. Then what you do is you take multiple pictures from your building, and then from that data, you then create a system called a point cloud data. Now, you basically grab those photos and upload them into a piece of software, which is called a reality capturing software. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm just going to talk to you about inside that. So from this, you get a point cloud data, and as it says there, it's a collection of data that it defines the multiple points in a 3D space, which then basically creates a cloud. Now, from these points, you can create vertices, will then create faces, which creates your mesh. Before I continue, I just want to talk to you, here's a few examples of reality capture softwares that you can get that would do this for you. So you've got Autodesk Recap, Capture Reality, PhotoScan, and MeshLab. Now, you've got your mesh, and now you want to import it into your 3D modeling tool. And this is what it looks like. So on my right, there's a raw scan model. So once you've uploaded your mesh with the texture, that's what it will look like. And then let's say we only wanted to projection map that centerpiece. So here it is here. So we've cleaned up the model, and this is all that we want to projection map. But as you can see from it, it's very triangulated, and there's a lot of polygons, so you need to smooth this out. So what we use is another workflow called retopology, where basically it's like tracing the surface. As you can see what we've done on the right there. And here's another example of just a few 3D modeling tools if you're not aware of that. So there's Autodesk Maya, 3ds Max, Cinema 4D, and Blender. And now I'm going to pass it back to Will, that's going to talk about creating UVs for Objection Masterclass.
Thank you for that, Harrison. So we're going to talk about creating the UVs now on a mesh. It's not going to be the one we're looking at just then. It's going to be another one. We used it with Hippo. So what are UVs? So who knows what UVs are and who's used them? Okay, nearly everyone here, which is good. So one thing that I've sort of learned in the last couple of days when I've been doing my other talks is when you apply UVs and what you apply UVs to. So UVs generally, well, always should be applied to the final mesh that goes into, say, notch. You never apply UVs to any high poly meshes. It's always the final mesh that you create which has UVs on. This means you make your low poly mesh, you do all your optimization work on the polygons, you do all your smoothing group work, you set up all your material IDs, you do all of this before you create your UVs. Once you've created your UVs, any changes you do on your mesh will absolutely destroy your UV set and you'll have to do it again. So it's a good workflow. Do your UVs at the end and then from that start producing your textures and your high poly meshes. It may sound strange, but you do your high poly meshes after you've made your low poly meshes. It's a really good workflow. It stops you redoing your work again and again. So I'm going to show you a basic UV creation using a box. You can look at the UVs as if they're the skin of this box. Each face of this box has its corresponding UV polygon. When you UV map, you unwrap the skin of the box, spreading it flat onto a surface. These UV faces will become the surface that your texture information will be drawn into. So I create all my UVs using Studio Max. I don't create them in anything else. You can use your preferred 3D software. So we take our simple box, we unfold all the sides of the box, and we lay it out as optimally into the texture space as we can. Another good trick is to always, where the seams and where you can, is join the seams and the verts on the UVs so you don't have any edges showing in your UV maps. So try and keep front faces of, say, the buildings. All those polys should have welded UVs, so it's like just peeling it off in one go. So now you can see there's a cross shape on the right-hand side. That UV set is sat on your texture space. So anything you draw inside the UVs on that texture space will appear on the box. This is another reason why you should always do a unique UV set. If the UVs were overlapping in any way, if you put anything into that texture space where the UVs are overlapping, it will show on all the other polys. I'll go into this later. I'm going to show some examples of that. So now we're going to look at whether we should use automatic UVs or whether we should do it all by hand by using unique mapping. So how do we create the UVs on the 3D model? So again, using your 3D package, you can, what I would tend to do with something like this, a lot of people do this, they'll start off by using a planar map. So a planar map will project the UVs onto the flat surface from the front, which for a lot of the time that works okay for what you want. But there are issues with doing this, because if you front face project map UVs that way, the UVs will overlap. So for instance, the pillars in this image on the left, if you can just about see them, will overlap on all the building parts behind, so which won't give you full control of your texture or when you're doing your projection mapping. And I'm going to cover this later. So if I was UVing a model, I'd use planar mapping, I'd use a bit of box mapping, and I'd split the model up and say for the majority of it, I'd use planar mapping to produce my UVs, and then I'd do a lot of handwork stitching UVs together. Once you've done that, you'll end up with a map with lots of overlapping UVs, which as I've said, is not a very good thing to do. So what I'd then do is select all the UVs, and I would auto-pack them. And so what auto-packing does is it would separate all the UVs and put them in the texture space without any overlapping UVs. So everything would be unique, which is fantastic, which is what you want. But, there's another but. So when you make a building mesh, you'll have the sides of the buildings, you'll have the underneath parts of the buildings, you'll have a lot of parts of the building that aren't and won't ever be seen when you're doing your projection mapping. So what you do is you select all the faces that you want a projection map on. So you don't select any of the hidden faces that you're not going to be projecting map on, and you invert that selection. Then you select the UVs of that inverse, so all the polygons that you're not going to see on your building, you scrunch up into a tiny little space on your texture map. And the reason you do this is because you don't need those UVs, so they're taking up texture space that could be used on the building surface. So then you take your building surface UVs, and then you repack them into the texture space again for a second time, and that will give you the optimal texture space for the front of your building. So everything on your texture will be or the majority of it will be the space you're using on the front of your building. So one, you could potentially use a smaller texture, which will save you memory, or you could just increase the resolution and do some really cool stuff. So here's an example of the scanned building and what happened when the scanned building did the UVs. So this is the texture that it produced. I think you can just about make out on the left-hand side, that's the UVs for the building. So it automatically created them. The things that are circled in red, the parts of the building circled in red on the right-hand side, that's the space the UV projections are going to be put onto. So that's an 8K texture, and you're using, what, a tenth of it? Not even that. So that is a total waste of resource. If I was doing that, I'd grab all those faces, all the ones not being used, and I'd scrunch them up into the tiny little part of the texture that you can't see, and enlarge all those bits of the front of the building to make the most of my texture space, and then make it a 2K map. And then you're saving on resources, and everything runs better. So, unique UVs and why they're important. On the building on the left-hand side, I did a front planar map, which works well. You can see the UVs are pretty nice, but I also painted the pillars red. And you can see on the left-hand side that the pillars, the red from the pillars is also being projected onto the building behind. When we were doing this with Green Hippo, they used 4 projectors coming from the sides. So we couldn't do anything with the pillars at all. You couldn't remove them. You couldn't do any fancy effects on them because it projected behind. So, well, we obviously didn't do that because we knew what we were doing with UVs, but as an example. So what we did is, on the right-hand side, we made all the UVs unique. You can see, I'll show you this later, but the pillars are all red, but nothing else is red. And the best thing about it is you can select the UVs of the pillars, and you can put them on a big chunk of texture map on their own, and you can just paint the color red on it. It's not going to get onto any other part of the building. Whereas on the left-hand side, even if you're really precise, you only viewed that building from the front, if you paint the red on those pillars, there's still a chance it could bleed onto the other parts of the building. So making unique UVs is really important. It's really simple, so you might as well do it. It literally takes like 5-10 minutes, but it's just knowing to do it. So I'm coming back to, this is just an example. showing what I mean when I was making the most of my texture map. So the unique UVs, the UVs at the front of the building are all in white, and the UVs of the parts of the building you don't see are all in red. And on the right-hand side, well, if you look from the front, everything's white. If you look from the side, all the bits you're not going to see from the projection mapping are in red because we don't need it. So we just shove it up in the corner. You could make it even smaller than that, but I was just making it visual so you could see it today. So now we move on to low poly models and why we'd create one. So the reason we created this low poly model is we wanted to run a fracture simulation. We wanted to make the building look like it was falling down. We could have used the original building mesh, but it's got open edges. So you can't fracture an open edge mesh. If the mesh didn't have open edges, because it's so complicated, if you try and fracture that mesh, it's going to cost a heck of a lot in performance. So it's always best to make a low poly model. So I created that. The main thing to do when you're creating a low poly model is just to try and match the silhouette of your building as much as possible. So when the meshes do swap out to set off the simulation, there's less of a pop. So once I've built that low poly model, there's another thing you can do just to make it look a little bit more like the original. You can use the original building's details, or the high poly building's details, and you can bake the normals from that. So you can bake a set of normals and an ambient occlusion map that you can put onto your low poly building. Obviously, the low poly building will have to have a set of UVs as well. But on something like that, it's dead easy to make, for me anyway. Right, and then, so what we also wanted to do is we wanted to make some kind of waterfall simulation. So there are several ways we could do this. We basically Matt wanted to put some physics balls, well, these are tiny little, I don't know what particles, yeah, particles. They're small particles, and he wanted it to bounce off the building like a waterfall. So we could, again, use the original mesh of the high poly building, but to turn that into a collision object would be really expensive, and you're going to lose loads of performance because there's so many polygons in it. So what we can do is, again, go back to the original low poly model, or the new low poly model, and we can use that and turn it into a collision primitive. And then we just put that into the scene, turn it to a collision primitive. Because it looks almost like the original building, it's going to look like it's bouncing off the right places. We could have used a collision box or something, but it's just not detailed enough. So that's another use of your low poly building. But we haven't finished there. There's another thing you can do with your high poly building when you're doing projection mapping, and that's splitting up the mesh. And there's several reasons we split up the mesh. We wanted to target different parts of the building to do different things. So, for instance, we wanted the pillars to collapse, so we split those out from the original mesh. We wanted to do something similar where we, I think we cracked the inside of the building, keeping the two sides of the building, but we didn't want the window detail to interfere with what we were cracking up, so we had to remove the windows and put in a low poly, just a basic box in between, and then we baked on the ambient occlusion and normals so it looked like the high poly original version. And so that's building the mesh, building UVs and low poly model, and we are now going to look at, and here's the final simulation that we did, but it's, I just recorded that on my phone, so it's not great, but you get the effect we were trying to get. And we couldn't have done that without good UVs or a low poly model. So now we're going to look at making some cool graphics to go on our building. And I'm going to hand you back over to Harrison, who's going to show you how to do it.
Okay, cool. So I'm not going to talk about how to create content and stuff. I can imagine now in these past 2 days, you know quite a lot and your brains are hurting. So I'll make this quite quick. I think we're running over time anyway now, so I'll make this quite brief. So what we're going to talk about now is you've created your content in Notch with your 3D model. And now you need to export the UV camera. So then you can import it into a media server. So there's 2 ways of exporting in Notch. There's from a video or from a Notch block. But first, before we start that, I'm just going to talk about UVs and how to do that. So let's grab our UV camera node and plug it straight into our root. And then all I've got in the scene right now is just a few lights and our model and just a default material. So we'll just grab our object and we'll put it into our object node here. And then once we go into our camera, we will notice that our UVs are here, but they're upside down. So what we'll also do is go into our UV camera and just flip our y-axis. So now they're straight. And then once you've done that from your content, you're good to go. So if I show you a few examples, this is just a few from our UV camera point of view. But if I show you from the 3D world, oh, wrong one. Always make sure you click on the layer. I always do that. And then we go there. So this is what's going on in the 3D world. We just have a few lights, that are using the math modifier just to move around. And then from our UV, that's what it looks like. Okay, so now as you can see, I have multiple layers from the 20th second to around about 1 minute 45. So we just go straight into our file and export video, and you put in the resolution of what the building needs, your codec, obviously the file name, and then you press OK. And then from a media server for a Notch block, you just go into project, you compile for a media server, create it 64-bit, you save it, you're good to go. And then you just import it into your media server. Just going to quickly just show you what it looks like. So for this demo, we're just going to use Hippo. And we're just using the visualizer just so I can show you. And if I go into here, so you can use a Notch block or a video file. So I've got my video file here. And then we just go and have a look in the visualizer. And if I press play, and I just speed it up a little bit so we can just see all the content. If it wants to work. There we go. And here's the end product. So, as Will said, UVs are very extremely important, especially with a work like this. Whether you're the guy creating the 3D model or you're the person creating the content. And a lot of the time, I've spoken to people that go, "Oh, don't worry about don't worry about the UVs. It's not important. Just do it from a perspective. It's fine." But that's not always the case. And that is the end of our presentation. Do you want to just slide it? Has anyone got any questions? Yeah.
So after you created your model and your UVs, presumably you have to get that model, those UVs, to a media server?
Correct. Yes. So when you've created it in Notch and you export your video file, make sure that your UV camera is showing in the display. So then that video file and that Notch block will then be straight imported into the media server. Yeah.
Last comment about perspective versus UV, like when it's good, when is it good to use UV?
So you only use perspective from when one point of view from your audience. That's not always the case. Sometimes your audience is looking at it from a side view, and that's when those UVs are quite important. Because otherwise the content won't look the same. You'll get UVs that are very stretched, so your content will look stretched. Because your UVs will be stretched.
You shape it properly inside the perspective.
From what? From your media server? But I mean, from my point of view, in my opinion, that doesn't work as well. Yeah.
Just a follow-up on that. But if you've done like a perspective mapping, like in cinema, you just do a frontal mapping.
Yeah.
And you've got just projected from one position, and that we're not like in the example you gave.
Yeah.
You need projection behind the columns, so you didn't have overlapping UVs. If you're just doing a frontal projection, is separating your UVs that much more useful?
I think so, yeah. If you wanted to, we had 4 projectors for that building, and they were coming in at the sides, so we could get all the faces behind on the building. But I think it would be harder for you to pick out things like if, say, you did have the pillars, did have one projector, it'd be really, you would get a little bit of bleeding and stuff. If it doesn't bother you, but it wouldn't take too much to take those pillars and just move them to a different place, make them unique, keep the rest of the building. You can do things like that as well. Yep, okay.
With the UV camera, I can understand how it captures the lights.
Yeah.
And things onto the mesh, but then with the particle example where it rained over, is that also captured?
Correct. Yeah. So that's also captured through the UV camera.
I tried to use the UV camera before for a similar thing, and I was probably my fault.
Okay.
I wasn't able to replicate the results you got.
Right. Okay.
With that, then does that work in the sense that if I had a sphere, for example,
Yeah.
rotating around the mesh, it would capture from that UV?
That's correct. Yes. Yes. That is.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Do you need like a minimum space between elements on the UV?
Yeah, it's good to push them out a bit. When I do UVs, I try and push them out, say, 4 pixels, well, a couple of pixels at least. You can set that, for Studio Max, you can set that in the parameters when you pack them. So if you don't have any space and they're right up against each other, you'll get texture bleed. And you can't stop that unless you've got a gap between the actual UVs. It's just a naturally occurring thing. It'll do on anything. It's horrible. So yeah, make a space between the UVs, definitely.
Can I just clarify, the UV camera will only pick up light sources, while actually if you're doing animation, you actually have to capture it. And then, for example, in skies, you have to re-project that using perspective map. Because the UV camera will only pick up baked lights, lighting. So if it's a sphere, it will not be picked up by the UV camera.
I mean, I use a direct map in D3 for when I do a notch block and stuff like that.
Yeah, but so if you're placing a sphere in notch,
Yeah.
as
in just a object, yeah.
it will obviously not be captured by the UV camera in notch. So you have to render it from a camera,
Right.
from a new camera, and you need to re-project that from a perspective camera in D3.
Yeah. I mean,
It's just trust me.
of course. So obviously, when you're doing stuff like that, and you need a light source, of course. So you'd use something like a skylight,
The
then.
camera will only pick up lights.
Yeah, exactly. So you would have a light source in there. Yeah. Yes.
How important do you see the workflow of photogrammetry when you anyway have to retopologize the model instead of just taking a plain photo with a wide camera and then modeling from the photo and extruding the model however you need it?
Yeah.
What would you rather recommend?
Instead of photogrammetry. Well, I mean, if you have the measurements for that building, then yes, absolutely, you can do it that way. You can just get the size, or you can take a photo, and then from knowing the measurements, just in a 3D modeling tool, use a plane, and then you can do the size from there.
You just need to be careful of any distortion when you're taking the photo. So if you took it from miles away with a zoom, that'd probably be all right. But if you're standing under a building, take a photo like that, you're not really going to be able to model from that. You could probably change the photo in Photoshop so the building looks a bit straighter, but things are going to distort. So it's...
I came to the idea that when you use like a portrait lens, then you have the least distortion. And here,
Okay.
if it's a huge building and you're standing on the floor,
Yeah.
photographing up,
Yeah.
you get of course distortion, but
Yeah.
you can correct that easily in Photoshop, but you won't have the bending that like a fisheye camera or
Yeah.
fisheye lens.
Yeah. You can do it that way.
So because I think that the photogrammetry way is a hard way.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
takes a lot of stuff.
And it's probably a bit more expensive as well, yeah.
Last question.
Could you show an
example of the node graph with the non-lighting effects, like the particles?
Sure. So I could show you the particle effect that we had. So this is what we got here. I mean, unfortunately I haven't created this. This is Matt's one they did for the Hippo masterclass. So what we've got here is just a particle effect that is hitting the render to texture for that UV camera. We'll bring that up there.
So there's a camera for the render to texture to get the perspective of the particles, and that's getting fed
Into the UV camera, yes, correct.
I think that's the workflow that's confusing.
Okay.
Because I've also tried this and not had those results.
Okay, that's interesting.